Welcome to episode 8 of the Business of E-commerce podcast, LinkedIn Live. Today, we're going to talk about brand building for e-commerce merchants, and I'm back here with Dale Harrison. Dale and I have done a few different episodes before around this topic, and we have been talking quite a bit about multi-channel. So, Dale, maybe let's just get started from the multi-channel angle, right? We have been saying that if you're launching an e-commerce business, you need to build your own site, but you also need to list on Amazon.com and Walmart.com and all these marketplaces because those are all places where you're getting discovered through search. And if you're not there, maybe the competitor is taking away that sale. So that's great, but at the same time, I think it's also important that these businesses build their own brand through, let's say, their own Shopify store or WooCommerce or BigCommerce store. So let's just get started with that whole concept today.
Right. Because again, if you're just starting out or you're early stage, your biggest problem is nobody knows you exist. And you have to be able to solve that problem. And and one of part of the advantage of a multi-channel strategy is that by putting yourself in places where your potential customers already are and are already looking, because again, if you have a fairly new e-commerce site, by definition, they're not looking at your site because they don't know it exists. So you have to put yourself out there in front of where your future buyers are. And to a large extent, those future buyers are either going to be at competitor sites or at these big e-commerce platforms like Walmart, Amazon, Target, those sort of platforms. And so a big part of being on those sites is that's essentially brand marketing for you because you're giving potential buyers a chance to discover that you exist.
Mm-hmm. So let's say you're listed on those sites, right? And Amazon has like so many different sellers. Sometimes Amazon is selling the product on their own. You can see like sellers from overseas, a lot of Chinese sellers are selling products there. So once, from my experience of shopping on Amazon, when I'm buying from a third party, I'm always going and checking out their site to make sure that this is a legit company and that I'm not getting scammed on Amazon. So let's talk about that. So that to me is an opportunity for them to discover you as a brand. They discovered your product through a category search and they found like, let's say, 5 sellers selling it and they picked you. How do you differentiate yourself from the rest of the sellers, and how can you use that as an opportunity to uh, present your brand in front of those merchants, or sorry, in front of those customers?
Right. So you have two problems you're trying to solve here. One is you want them, if they're actively looking right now for the sort of thing you sell, you want to sell to them. So you need to convince them to buy. But what you also want is to do things that will increase the likelihood that not only will they buy, but that they'll remember. They'll remember who, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to make an association between your key branding elements and your category, your product category. And those key branding elements are logo, name, company name, product name, your colors, your fonts, your taglines. And to the extent that you can present these, within, say, the Amazon environment or the Walmart environment, you have to be able to do that. Because what you want isn't just the sell today, but you want all the future sales that are going to come from that. And, clearly they're going to remember Amazon, but what you want them to do is remember you. And then, and this goes beyond just how do you present the product, on the Amazon product page. It's, at some point, if they buy, you're going to ship the product to them. And you need to be able to extend that branding to how it's packaged. If it comes in, a recyclable cardboard box with no printing, that's probably not going to work as well as if it comes in a box that is highlighting, your key branding elements, your distinctive branding elements, along with your category. And, if I go to Zappos and I buy a pair of Nikes, it's going to come in a box with a giant Nike swoosh on top of the box. Where there's no confusion about what's inside the box and who sent it to me. And so, one of the things is that even though you're not selling on a store shelf, packaging still makes a huge difference because it's the opportunity to make that brand impression and to make those associations between your key branding elements and your product category, at the moment that someone is actually opening up your product.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think in the Amazon context, this becomes challenging because a lot of people use FBA. So Amazon is like picking, packing, and shipping the package for you, so you don't have complete control on like what box they're putting that in. Amazon also supports the model of FBM, that's fulfilled by merchant. And if the brand or the retailer takes that approach, then you have complete control on how it's being shipped because it's getting shipped out of your warehouse, right? And then you can maybe include like a discount code or like some sort of an insert that gives you ask the customer to go to your branded site the next time instead of buying it from Amazon. And that way now you have the customer visiting on your site and getting more exposure to the brand directly. So
Right.
that's a strategy I've seen like a lot of FBA merchants do. If you're doing like fulfilled by Amazon FBA shipments, that gets challenging because you don't have complete control on what goes into the box. But with FBM, I think that's another side benefit of, yeah, it may be a bit more hassle to run your own warehouse and fulfill your own orders, but I think there's a benefit of like getting that brand in front of the customers. Let's talk about brand
Well,
itself. Like, I think there's a lot of confusion about branding, brand awareness. So what's a good way to think about it?
so, well, one last thing on the FBA thing is you don't, with FBA, you don't have control of what the outer box looks like. That's an Amazon box,
Yeah.
but you still have control of the packaging that your product is, is sitting on the shelf encased in, and that's the packaging where you need to think about
Right.
using that packaging as though you're going on a retail shelf where you need to really communicate, you know, distinctive brand associations through that packaging. So even with FBA, you have a control of that, even if you don't have total control of the entire experience.
That's true. Yeah.
Um, but going on to what you're talking about there, one of the other things to be aware of is, or to think about, is that branding is not the same thing as brand awareness. Branding is a series of distinctive assets that you're going to associate your product or your brand with. So that's a logo, colors, fonts, taglines. Um, you know, you know, if you have an animal mascot, which turns out to be highly effective in helping people remember.
Mhm.
If you have a jingle, that's another
Mhm.
thing that is seldom used today in advertising, but has repeatedly been proven to be one of the most effective brand assets that you can use. There are products that have not existed in half a century that people can still recognize the jingle to this day.
Mhm. Yeah.
And uh, so, um, but the whole point of these distinctive brand assets is you want to look like yourself, meaning you do not want to be mistaken for someone else. If
Mhm.
everybody's using blue, you probably need to use orange.
Mhm.
If everyone is using sans serif fonts, you might want to use cursive. Um,
Mhm.
you have to be able to distinguish yourself so that there isn't confusion, because you're one person in a crowd.
Mhm.
And if everyone in the crowd is wearing exactly the same color shirt and exactly the same hat and has exactly the same haircut, it becomes very easy to be mistaken for someone else. And
Mhm.
so you want to think in terms of your branding elements are designed to make you different than your competitors.
Is
Um,
this the idea of like the differentiation versus distinctiveness of the brand?
right. So the differentiation is, how is your product different in terms of the value it delivers to the customer? But but distinctiveness is in terms of, do I look different than customers? And you, for instance, you see this with a lot of Chinese merchants on places like Amazon,
Mhm.
where there is this sort of extreme sameness among them, partly because they're not in the same kind of hyper competitive environment, um, often in Asia, that they are in the US. And there isn't quite that same sort of sense of how to be highly distinctive. So you see names that are hard to pronounce, names that are hard to remember, you know, no use at all of logos, in
Mhm.
many cases, or logos that are, completely indistinct. And, and so it becomes very difficult for someone to, develop a durable, persistent memory of this particular brand as a unique identity. But then the second thing you want to do is you have to tie those branding elements to to the product category, because especially for something like e-commerce, when the customer is ready to buy, if they don't think of you at that moment, you've lost the sale. So you need to be in their head to be able to have a reasonable chance of being considered the next time they buy the thing that you sell.
Okay. And then once you choose those elements, I guess like it's also important that you don't change it, right? Because I know that a lot of companies just try to refresh their branding very often. So I think this kind of goes, it sounds like where all of this means, okay, it's very hard for someone to make you, it's very hard for you to make someone remember you, and you're attaching that memory to some of the branding elements on your site. And once that memory is formed, if you keep changing things often, then you just like restarting the whole memory, right? So you want them to associate the memory of you with all the brand images and the logos and the colors and everything. And if jingles are applicable, which I guess like for most of us is not, um, or like animal mascots, and I haven't seen, like we don't have one. I have not seen anything like that in our industry for a while. But once you come up with those assets and you attach those memories, your goal is to make sure that you don't rapidly change it. And I think I remember us talking about this example of Coca-Cola logo hasn't changed, like has been subtle changes over the last 150 years or so, right?
Yeah, and for instance, the use of during their winter campaigns, the use of the polar bear.
Yeah.
That started in 1923, over a century ago.
Yeah.
And so the really successful companies tend to have very, very stable, long-term, unchanging brand identities. Nike, 60 plus years, Apple, 50 years now, coming up very close now on 50 years for Apple.
Yeah.
And, and the core branding assets have not fundamentally changed with these companies. And even when they do minor tweaks to them, they're still retaining the core look and feel of those logos. And the other thing to think about is that those distinctive brand assets. Let's just talk about logos. That logo doesn't live on your product, and it doesn't live on the box. It lives inside the heads of future buyers. And everything that you're doing to build brand awareness, you're having to pay for. I mean, this is not inexpensive. So if you're investing 50 or 100,000 a year, in ongoing campaigns where at least some aspect of that campaign is to expose people to your brand identity, you are slowly making this investment. You're building up, it's like putting money in the bank. You're building up an asset in the collective mental space of your future buyers. If you suddenly decide to do a brand refresh, and now, the logo looks different, the taglines look different, the colors look different, you change the name of the product or the name of the company, what you've essentially done is taken years of investment that you've made by slowly putting that information in the minds of future buyers and basically just flushed it down the toilet. I mean, you've effectively given your entire customer base a collective head injury. Where yesterday they would recognize you, but today they can't. It's like they have amnesia. And so so these inclinations to get talked into doing a rebrand or a brand refresh is extremely dangerous because it's extraordinarily costly. Unless, again, if you've done no investment in marketing and no one knows you exist and you want to do a brand refresh, there's no downside.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
if you've been around for any length of time, you have any set of prior customers, and you've made any investment in marketing using those distinctive brand assets, you really have to think heavy about the real cost of it, which is basically having to pay all over again to put back into people's heads what you had already previously paid to put there.
Okay. So let me ask another angle aspect of this. Right? Let's say I'm launching a DTC e-commerce brand today, and I have a Shopify store and I'm selling on Amazon. At what stage should I start thinking seriously about branding? And I guess it also depends on the what this entrepreneur strength is, because I think we were talking earlier about another company in our space that was spending a lot of money on like brand, and they're creating these professional videos upfront before they even had like a strong product. So, and I've seen like depending on the strength of the entrepreneur, maybe they'll go first, invest a lot in the product, or in other cases, I've seen like people invest a lot in branding. So, is there like a what's a good way to think about it? When should I start spending on building brand awareness and solidifying my brand imagery and all the brand assets, uh,
I
versus
mean,
like taking that money and spending it on other things?
I think very early on, because even if you're running ads whose sole purpose it is to click this button and buy now, um, you still need to be able to take the opportunity to use that to implant, those brand images and those brand associations in the
Hmm.
minds of users. So I think you have to do it very early on. And the rough rule of thumb that I've used when I've worked with early stage companies, so these are companies that haven't launched yet, and they're gearing up for their launch, is that you need to start doing intensive brand awareness marketing. You know, the rough rule of thumb for me is 2 buying cycles before you're ready to launch. Um,
Hmm.
and so for a lot of customers I work with, that buying cycle is going to be 6 months or so. So, these are
Hmm.
often, this is more B2B than B2C, but B2C will be a bit shorter. But, if you've got a 3 to 6 month buying cycle, you probably need to start marketing 6 to 12 months before you have a product to sell.
Hmm. Yeah.
And, and the example I always give is that if you look at Hollywood and how they market movies, almost the entirety of the marketing budget for a movie is spent before anybody can buy the product,
Hmm.
because otherwise they're going to open to empty theaters for the first 3 months. And
Right.
so, because nobody has ever bought from, a store that they didn't know existed. No one has ever bought a product that they had no idea was available.
Hmm.
And so, people only buy what they're aware of.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Is that two buying cycle? Is that tied to the 95/5 rule that we have talked about?
roughly, and well, also to what's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which
Okay.
is a whole body of research around how rapidly people forget things that they've been exposed to.
Mm.
And
Okay.
and generally for, in terms of purchasing, in terms of marketing and business, um, going through a purchase cycle will tend to refresh your memory, because you're often looking across, or have an opportunity to be directly exposed to a range of brands during
Mm.
that purchase cycle. And so, uh, but this forgetting curve is going to be different for different types of products. It depends on uh, on how expensive the product is and how high consideration it is.
Okay.
Um, so for instance, if someone has a new brand of butter, most people buy butter once a week.
Hmm.
If you have a new brand of butter, the rate at which people forget about that once they've seen the ad is relatively quick. But they can then be re-exposed once they're in the store and they see it on the shelf.
Mm.
Um, if you talk about buying cars, most people buy a car every 5 to 7 years, and
Hmm.
so and that's a very high consideration purchase. It's not like buying a stick of butter in the store.
Hmm.
So there's a tendency for those brand memories to persist much, much longer for more expensive, higher consideration goods, which also tend to be goods on long purchase cycles versus,
Mm.
very, kind of the fast moving consumer uh, good categories.
Okay, cool. So to kind of, I think we have run out of almost run out of time. So to kind of emphasize the main points, main takeaways from this, right? First one is in e-com DTC, we have already established that you have to go multi-channel. But when you go multi-channel, if you're selling through marketplaces, it's very important for you to have a distinctive brand presence. And you can achieve that through your Shopify store or your WooCommerce, BigCommerce stores. So even when you're listing through Amazon and Walmart, you still need to like present your brand. I guess that's part one. Part two is when you create the brand imagery and all the brand assets, it's very difficult to form that memory in someone's head. So once you create it, just stick to it. Don't keep making like don't change that once a year. Don't do brand refreshes once a year, right? You can make slight tweaks and improvements, but stick to that once you choose like a certain set of imagery associated with your brand, just stick to that. And I guess the third aspect is that I think you were saying you need to spend on brand awareness at least like 2 buying cycles before the buying process. So you have to get started early on. And it's one of those things where like it's a long game, right? You can't like it's not like the PPC where you just run a Google ad and then you get a click and then you're measuring like at what rate are they converting. It sounds like it's one of those things where like we need to build up over time. It takes a while for the brand awareness to kick in and those memories to form in the heads of people. And then when they get into the market and they're ready to buy, they're going to remember you and come to you, right?
Right. And one thing to always keep in mind is that the brand only has commercial value to you if it's inside someone's head.
Mhm.
And to some extent, you don't care how it got in their head.
Yeah,
What matters is that it's in their head. And
it's
so
remaining there. Yeah.
so you have to think about the full range of ways that people can be exposed to your brand.
Mhm.
So the obvious one is doing brand marketing, running Facebook ads, running TV ads, those sort of things. But retail shelf presence and how you do the branding and the packaging, for retail, how you do branding and your packaging for using third party uh, platforms like Amazon or Walmart. But it's also other things like word of mouth,
Mhm.
because a lot of us that have not bought in a given category will often tend to ask trusted colleagues or friends that about their experience. And so don't underestimate the opportunity to um you know to go outside people that are immediately ready to buy, because that word of mouth is another form of brand marketing. And then the other thing is the actual prior lived experience with the product. If someone is actually, this is one of the reasons that Nike remains so untouchable, is that uh you know you have people who have used their shoes for literally decades now.
Mhm.
And so when they think of running shoes, the very first and maybe only thing that comes in their head is the word Nike, and
Right.
because of the lived experience of the product. So all of those things are part of brand awareness. And these are all things that you've got some ability to have some control over.
Mhm. Cool. Awesome. I think it's a great episode. So let's wrap up today. Before we go, just a plug for Ordoro. We are a multi-channel inventory and order management platform for e-com DTC, e-com direct to consumer. We have a lot of customers on Shopify and Amazon and Walmart. So do take a look at us. That's all we have for episode 8 of the Business of E-commerce. Thank you.